Hello and welcome to Eavesdropping at the Movies. I'm Mike.
I'm Jose.
And we've been watching a film on MUBI again,
Yes.
which Jose's obsessed with, the streaming service that curates the films it puts out.
I'm finding it the best place to see international art house cinema and classic films, and they're beautifully curated.
Yeah, so as we've talked about before, they put out, they're showing at any one time 30 films. Each one has 30 days and then it goes off, so there's one added and one removed each day. And the film we decided to watch today was In the Intense Now, or in the original Portuguese, I think, No Intenso Agora, which is a film from last year. It's a documentary.
It's an essay film.
Yeah, that's more. Yeah, that's more accurate. It's an essay film. It's based entirely on archival and found footage
And
of
home
movies
movies
of Brazil, China, Czechoslovakia, and France in the late 60s, around the era of a kind of revolution.
Yeah, it's all about basically 1968.
Yeah, pretty much directly. Although the Chinese footage is of the director's mother, and that was of a trip she took in 1966, which is when the Cultural Revolution began.
Yes.
So the director is João Moreira Salles, a Brazilian. I don't know any of his other work.
Neither do I.
Not familiar with him
I
at
know
all.
Walter Salles, but not João Moreira. I don't know who he is. And we haven't.
Do you know if they're even related?
No, I don't know if they're related. And actually, I'm just, at the moment, I'm not interested because we've just seen the film. So, as is usual with us, we just want to respond to what we've seen.
Well, had you seen it already?
No.
Oh, you were telling me to watch it,
No.
but I thought that was because you had seen it.
No. I mean, basically what happened is, and this is where I say that these films in MUBI are so beautifully curated, because I saw Pierre Goupil's film, which is called Mourir à 30 ans, Half-Life, and it's all an autobiographical film about his experiences in, the student protest movement as a high schooler, and then leading up to 68. And actually it's very interesting because that film, which was made I think in 82, but it was made about the events from 64 leading up to 68 and slightly beyond. And it's kind of like a memoir of May 68, of being a student activist, and of his friendship with a guy called Pierre Catini, I think. And what happens is that the beginning of that film, which begins very beautifully. It begins with something like saying, Veronique, she was tall, brunette, wonderful. She was the trainer of these activists, and then it says, she committed suicide, blah. And then it goes on to another person committed suicide, blah. Then another person committed suicide, blah. And then, that film is structured around what happened to my best friend who also committed suicide. So, the idea that these young people, who were already nostalgic for their youth, when they were barely out of their youth because it had been so intense, right, that it frames this movie in the intense now and is actually kind of cited within it. I just thought it's one of those things that makes it so interesting to watch a movie because it's curated, so there's a relationship between one film and another.
Yeah, so they're both on it. That film, Mourir à 30 ans, is it's called Half a Life in English, but actually in when it's referenced in the Intense Now, the subtitles call it To Die at 30, which is the more direct translation.
Yes.
That was actually when the film I thought was at its most self-indulgent.
Oh, I love
to me, because that was when I sort of I understood they wanted to make the reference, but then it just showed a whole section of this other film, and I thought, you can't do that. Like, you can't just show a whole intro to someone else's film.
It's and beautiful.
Yeah, but it's someone else's work.
But you're citing it, and you're acknowledging it, and you're saying when it was made and in what context and how it was used.
Yeah, but then you showed just a whole section of it, and it's also got to the point.
2 or 3 minutes.
It was a big section, though. It was like the point had been made, and again, it was rather like when towards the end of the film just now. When you return to China and you're seeing the mother's home footage again, and the director narrates, we should say, he narrates, I think, in Portuguese,
yes,
but it's translated in English in the subtitles, and he's narrating over his mother's home footage of her visit to China, as he does throughout the film. But towards the end, it starts to feel very self-indulgent to me, where it's like watching someone's home movie, and you go like, I don't, you know, if someone comes back from holiday, and they get all these photos, and you go, I didn't really want to see these, but I have to sit here and be polite while you're showing them to me.
I didn't see that at all. I mean, I thought it was very interesting because it's tying in all these political movements, and it's very deconstructive. So
I'm only talking right at the very end.
No, I know.
Yeah.
But the significance of the end is, you know, that here are these mass political movements, you know, and on the one hand, his mother, who is clearly a very well-to-do, you know, Brazilian, who actually lives in France and has enough money, you know, to travel on what looks like very posh tours of China at the height of the Cultural Revolution, and Japan, you know, and dressed very chicly and so on. So, you know, but nonetheless, that the feeling, the sense of premature nostalgia, of living intensely only when experiencing that which is most unexpected and foreign, is something that I think there's a link made throughout all of it.
Yeah, I think that's certainly true, and I think I mean, I'm certainly critical of the end of the film because I felt it went on for far too long.
Yes.
It felt like it had a lot of endings. Remember like how Lord of the Rings ended? And you sort of went over and over again, like they keep on saying goodbye. Like every time it kind of cut to black in the last half hour of this film, I was like, okay, this is the end now. Oh no, it wasn't. But in the hour and a half preceding that, I thought there was some fantastic stuff and some really interesting. It's something that I don't like about documentaries in film is that I think they sometimes ignore what film is really good at. Because what film is really good at is not making an argument. That's what the written word is really good at. What film is good at is evoking a feeling. And that's what this documentary does. It's not. It's not about. It is to an extent about saying, you know, here were the reasons behind these protests and revolutions and uprisings and you know, going into sort of the meaning and the logic of it or whatever. It is to an extent about that, but what it's really about is creating this feeling of, you know, when people say you had to be there, you know, you weren't there, man. That's what people say about the, you know, kind of sort of the swinging 60s or whatever it is in the US. That's kind of what this film feels like. Like you had to. This is what this absolutely. The title is really appropriate. In the Intense Now, it's a really brief period of time. I mean, the May 68 in Paris was a month. It was a month-long revolution and just this incredibly intense feeling, and it puts you right in there and makes you feel like how these people felt.
It does that, but I would say, so I agree with you, but I think it goes further than that, because one of the things that I find so beautiful and intelligent and about this film is that it actually does textual analysis of the images themselves, so that, you know, you see something, you experience it, and then he points out something that you might not have noticed. And that starts from the very beginning. He says, this looks like a home movie of a family showing off their child, you know, but look at the nanny, right? And, you know, look at the nanny sneaking off the picture because she doesn't belong here. And actually in this move away from the picture, you have all these social, class, and racial relations in Brazilian culture. And you go, wow, right?
Yeah, it's in doing that, he teaches you to interpret images as you're looking at them. So, you know, kind of, you could watch them very blankly and just say, this is a home movie of a kid and a nanny in Brazil in the 1960s. But in actually analysing it, he teaches you to watch movies.
Yes.
In a way. It's fantastic. And he does a lot talk. The film is very much about sort of why people capture images and the way they're captured. So he talks about the student sort of spokesperson who became kind of a star in France. Combendit. And they're on a kind of Newsnight type programme. You know, kind of three sort of student revolutionaries and three figures of the establishment, and they're talking to each other. And Cohn-Bendit steals the scene, and he monologues, and he speaks very eloquently. I mean, I wanted to watch it just like without narration over. You know, I wanted to watch the whole thing. He speaks incredibly eloquently and with kind of great precision and intelligence about, you know, why people are rising up and what they want and what they're dissatisfied with. And then in the narration, Salles says, like, the camera noticed him. You know, the camera helped him to become a star in a way, and there's a kind of theatricality to it. I think actually Cohn-Bendit as well, in talking about it in hindsight, says, I think he said, like, I was theatre trained, and I used that theatricality to behave the way I did on the stage. There's a kind of theatricality in the way that the Paris movement operates, which is different to what you see of China and Czechoslovakia, I think. But again, it's related to the way that the camera captures images and how. So, for instance, when you're looking at Czechoslovakia, and you're looking at the Soviet army entering the city to quash the Prague Spring, the footage is home video taken from sort of inside an upper story flat. Looking down on the street, seeing the tank rolling down the street, and it's shaky and it's hidden, and he's hiding behind the curtain, and Salles is pointing all of this out to you, and he says, you know, this isn't the kind of footage that you saw in May '68 in France. So in that he's taking the context of the footage and the way it's been shot, and saying, like, this in itself is a commentary on the difference between what was happening in Czechoslovakia and what was happening in Paris. You know, there's a severity to what's happening in Czechoslovakia which makes the French uprisings sort of seem less serious in a way, or more frivolous, or there was less at stake. Perhaps. Right, it feels like there was a little less at stake, like lives weren't on the line.
Well, it's not so much that there was a little less at stake, but actually that it was done with more freedom and less fear. Yeah. So,
right, but there were never tanks rolling down the street at any point in Paris, and
well, that's why the camera could be out there,
right, exactly,
and so on. But I think the accent. I mean, the image which he points out is so evocative. I mean, hidden in the house, behind the curtain, with, so it has a lace curtain, and then also it has a heavy curtain that's occupying. It's peeking out onto the street. It doesn't dare be outside, right? I thought those readings, there's no other way of putting it, because there is a first person voiceover narration throughout that is showing you something, but then also kind of pointing out things to you of not only what the image is and what the people are saying and so on, but things that you might not have noticed. For example, how black people are barely present in the images of May '68, and how when they are present, they're hidden in a corner, and they're often wearing a suit, and the significance of that. And actually,
they're silent always.
And they're silent always. And there were three things that really caught my eye. So one is the footage with the philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, which is just, his hand on his ear saying, "I am now listening," right? Which is kind of, an iconic image. So he talks about, like, the power of that image in terms of its symbolism. The other is that at the end of the events in May '68, when de Gaulle does one of his broadcasts, he decides to do it on radio only because he doesn't want to show the figure of an old man. He wants to show the figure of resistance that spoke to France from London, during World... Yeah, power and unification.
Yeah, with his voice, he could promote... He could convey power in a way that when you saw the image of a 70 or 80-year-old man on TV, it wouldn't have done that.
That's right. So the images... So the power... He tells you how to read images, the significance of sounds. And then, at the very end of the film, he talks about the slogans, because one of the things that characterized May '68 was all of these, like, slogans of freedom, some of them very surrealistic. It wasn't just about, getting better wages and working conditions, but, about a new life, a new way of living, kind of, new possible. And he said, and then he reveals how, the most famous slogan of them all, which is "Sous le pavé la plage," under the paving stones, the beach, was actually something that had been very hard worked on by ad people. Yeah. Right? Yeah. So actually, kind of, those moments of analysis combined, with what is clearly an appreciation, and also an analysis of the differences among these three events, and then tying it in together in a very personal way in relation to his mother's encounter with China, which is also very beautifully shot because, you know, his mother is enthralled with the otherness, with the strangeness. She's got this whole interpretative framework, but actually there's all of these Chinese letterings, right? All these signs, which actually the son is now in a position to get translated, right? And you know, they have all these slogans of the Cultural Revolution, but also they have these things like, you know, American dog will, you know,
run in fear or something like that.
Right. So it's all kind of like this quite nasty, crude, anti-American, anti-Soviet, pro-Vietnam, you know, and you know all the worst excesses of the Cultural Revolution are right in front of his mother's face, but she doesn't have the means to understand them.
Well, that's an interesting point because actually, that's true to an extent. You're absolutely right about that. But then on the other hand, the worst excesses really are not in front of her face. Like that, it was a bloody, you know, sort of vicious time in China, and of course, shown to the VIP tourists coming from the West, that wasn't shown at all.
But she would have known how to read the signs. She would have known what the slogans meant had she been able to read the signs.
That's true. But nonetheless, like I think it's kind of, it's quite striking that of the three major countries shown in the film, Czechoslovakia, France, and China, China is essentially absent of, you know, kind of bloodshed or revolution
at all.
Right, exactly. So it's a kind of the Chinese kind of third of the film, if you like, the kind of that section, that part is really about his mother, and her, as you said, kind of the framework that she puts onto what she's seeing. So she talks about the way that Chinese people look, about their complexion, about how it makes the famous English complexion a joke, something like this, and how she likes the slenderness of their fingers and the way that they stand like porcelain dolls, and she doesn't like their voices. She thinks they remind her of cats meowing. Like this is the way that she kind of and there's nothing political to anything that she sees really. She doesn't interpret it in that way, and you know, and I think part of that, as you say, is that she doesn't understand sort of the Chinese that might clue her in, but it's being hidden from her as well. You know, I think the director, the narrator, establishes early on that she was given the VIP treatment as a Western tourist. Like they want to show the sort of the best side. They want to advertise to the West, as it were, when they visit.
Yes. I want to focus on the deaths that were shown. So, you know, basically, so we're shown these moments of social tension, these iconic moments of revolutionary intent in and the quashing down of that in Paris, in Prague, and then with moments in China and with moments in Brazil, and we're shown kind of three famous martyrs, really. So I think it was Jean Palac in Czechoslovakia. Jan Palach in Czechoslovakia, and then there was Gilles Toton in France, and Louis Edson in Brazil, who, you know, was killed, and there were mass protests around the death of all of these young people. And then the film contrasts, you know, how the death of Jan Palach was received.
Yeah, protest wouldn't be the right word for that. That was an outpouring of public grief.
Public grief. Okay, well that's what I mean.
Yeah. Okay.
So the public manifestation of the death of each of these young men in each of these three countries, and how they were treated. So, for example, he contrasts Jan Palach and the outpouring of mourning, right, of public mourning, with the kind of indignation of the Louis Etzel young man in Brazil, in which there was only one person that looked like they were crying. It was more a kind of indignation and anger, and actually you see his coffin being taken down the streets, and actually you know, if you had any sense, if you were if you had any faith at all, you'd be outraged by the way that this coffin was being treated, or the disrespect of the dead in the coffin, right? And also the contrast in France, where, you know, there was a march or a manifestation around the death, but actually that there was no grief, right? So kind of the readings of each of these three things and their symbolic value, in each moment, I thought was very, very fascinating.
Remind me of the circumstances of the deaths. I remember the Jan Palach one was
he burned himself.
He self-immolated.
He self-immolated.
Poured gasoline over himself and set himself alight. He was 20 years old. He was a student.
Yes.
And that one really struck me. That was because this was when the Prague Spring had been, you know, sort of quashed.
Yes.
And people were kind of settling into the new routine of what life was.
Yes.
And this is something the director spells out, you know. What his suicide did was kind of crystallize the feeling of kind of everything has gone wrong, you know, the kind of the sense of possibility that we had is completely dead, and everyone is returning to treat this as normal life.
That's right. So the argument in the film is that this mourning is in itself an acquiescence to a re-establishment of power.
Yeah.
Which I thought was a beautiful reading, and it shows it to you, actually.
Yeah, it is, and it's, and like I said, that's stuck with me.
Yeah.
That's quite haunting, because like to sort of, for someone to kill themselves in such a violent and public way, you want that to be, I suppose, sort of, you want that to be a catalyst for change, as opposed to the very opposite, which is a sort of a symbol of an acceptance that things will not change, and there is nothing left to do but kill yourself. Like that's awful.
Yes. Anyway, I love this film very much, and actually, it's full of beautiful poetic moments, really, where I think the personal footage comes in as well. So, you know, one thing is May 68, you know, but what comes after May? Well, the summer vacation, and all of a sudden it's all over, right? You know, and you have footage, wonderful home movies with, you know, what looks like that lovely Technicolor of the day, you know, where the reds really kind of are very intense and stand out from the rest of the image. And these lovely images of the family at the beach, you know, and kind of, and really all of the black and white anger, overturned cars, young people throwing things, is now just back to the routine of the family at the beach.
Yeah, there are contradictions in the film, because people, the director does bring up quotes from people talking about the May 68 revolution as having changed things permanently. But it's not something you really feel or see. Like the feeling you get from the film is of a kind of, where did it all go wrong, man?
No. I think I didn't read it that way. So I read that May 68 was not just about better working conditions or whatever. That it was almost like an imagining of a new way of life, new social relations, new,
But this is exactly it.
Yeah.
So, go on.
So, you know, the conversation with the young worker, the woman, so dissatisfied about having to return to work to the Van der factory, is all about that, right? You know, so actually, so things changed. There were better working conditions and so on, but this idea of a limitless possibility, it was not. The film says that it wasn't there, and actually it contrasts the student movement in France and in the U.S., and saying the U.S. one was radical. You had black people speaking, you had women speaking. In France, it was very masculinist. There was always men talking, you know. And actually, as soon as that moment was past, you know, though particular conditions might have improved, that sense of a possibility that all kinds of new social relations were possible disappeared with it. And that's why kind of, you know, some of the protagonists of these movements had a nostalgia before its time, that they were already young people too early feeling nostalgic for their youth because it had been such an intense moment of living in the now.
Yeah, well, and in that clip from Montréal 30 ans, it shows these young people in their early 20s or maybe just 20 writing their memoirs almost.
Yeah,
you know,
and actually
bizarre.
18, not
right.
Not,
yeah.
They were high school students.
But yeah, that's kind of what I'm saying. I think one of the things the film made me think about kind of modern equivalents, so particularly Occupy Wall Street, and also the sort of very recent and modern gun control movement in the United States following the Parkland shootings.
Yes. And the Black Lives Matter.
And Black Lives Matter.
You know.
But what it made me think about specifically, so thinking about Occupy Wall Street, one of the problems that Occupy Wall Street always had, it seemed to me, was that it was completely rudderless. It was a sort of vast but completely direction-free sort of generally sort of anti-capitalist movement that people had completely different ideas within it of what they wanted to see. Some people wanted the complete collapse of Western civilization, and some people wanted reasonable sort of regulations put on banking and so on and so forth. And it has essentially achieved nothing other than noise because of that, I think. And that to me really felt similar to what the film shows of May 68, which is that people there's no kind of single idea. Some people do have, for some people it is about wages and working conditions, and for others it is really about the possibility of a brand new way of living and imagine, was it that Cohn, what's his name? Cohn-Bendit says about we wanted to have a glimpse of a possibility of a non-capitalist world, essentially, is what he's saying. And in that quote, it's bizarre. He sort of says, like, we knew it wouldn't work, but we wanted to show just the glimpse that it could be possible. The point being that lots of people had lots of different ideas about what it could be, and that it kind of came up and then died so quickly.
Yes. But you see, I mean, one of the things that the film is wonderful at is that you see it. So, you see the head waiter saying, oh, you students, blah, blah, I joined the Communist Party, and your idea is that I could go to school at night after you work 12 hours. Yeah, so they're showing all of these, and the fights in front of the Wonder Factory between the actual workers, who have succeeded in obtaining better working conditions, and the university student who says, well, those are not good, that doesn't matter, right? Yeah. And I thought all that was fascinating.
And again, and what the film points out there is that the camera frames out that student.
Yeah.
He's no longer relevant to the conversation.
That's right.
The students aren't being listened to anymore, so the camera literally doesn't look at him.
And actually, I found that fascinating because in Montréal 30 ans, there's this expression that kind of basically all of the student movement died when there was a turn to the proletariat. I.e., when union leaders and workers and, the striving for better working conditions kind of superseded, the student agenda. And you think, well, if the revolution isn't for the workers, what is it for? Right? So this turn to the proletariat, which is seen as like, the nadir or the end point, it really is just the end point of these bourgeois students' involvement and being at the center, of power, really, or a voice, right? So I think the film is very interesting, and in a way, kind of, that would be my critique of it as well, right? Because, what one gets throughout the film is this sense of bourgeois entitlement to represent, depict, control, symbolize moments in history, right? So kind of.
Well, there's commerce and capitalism inserts itself.
Yes.
In there. So thinking particularly of Cohn-Bendit going to Berlin.
Yeah.
And his trip is paid for by a magazine because he can't afford it otherwise. Yeah. And so the photographer's there for 4 days and then taking loads of photos of him, and it becomes this kind of centre spread in the magazine. And the caption is, he goes off to spread his anarchy to Berlin. Yeah. And it's like, and the voiceover says, no anarchist has ever spread anarchy by being funded by a magazine for the middle class.
Exactly. So I thought, that was wonderful.
I thought that was wonderful, and I think that to me that goes along with the advertising thing as well. The advertising slogan, as you said earlier, that kind of
that
really spoke to me, because that kind of said like this. It's sort of the ultimate loss, really, that kind of capitalist sort of forces will find a way to monetize and capitalize on what you're doing. Like the counterculture becoming cool means that it can then be sold.
Yeah. So, and actually, I think they use the phrase the commodification of dissidents, right? So actually, dissidents can now be bought and sold for money. Yeah, it has a price. The price is the trip paid by Palimatch.
And that again, to me, is what conveys this idea in the film, that actually it's not really about saying like what a great time this was, that all this activity was happening. It's, to me, the feeling conveyed is really this feeling of it all went wrong.
Of sadness. Yeah.
Right, and of sadness and of sort of, what's the word? I can't think of the word.
Inertia, defeat.
Yeah, something like that. Like resignation. Resignation. The feeling of resignation that change kind of isn't possible and never was really, and the idealism shown in the film dies so quickly and is so easily sort of assimilated where it wants to be by the sort of the powers that be.
And yet, these images, these slogans, these actions, have stayed with us for 40 years and have become a kind of a symbol, a kind of a beacon of, what is possible, what happened once, So I think the film has like this richness of tone, in the sense that it's what you say is true. It's kind of, there's a resignation of defeat and so on, but also there's the romanticism of those actions, of that energy, that youth. Almost everyone is so young, right? And so I think kind of it holds both things together at the same time for me.
Yeah.
And also what I loved about it, there's something very, very beautiful about those images. Yeah, those home movies have an intensity. The footage that is shot on the streets of Prague, it's like grainy, hidden, out of focus. You have like kind of what looks like a whole battalion of soldiers going into a house, and they're really grainy, out of focus, behind a lace curtain, and it's kind of, it feels almost like ghostly and deadly, like the images have a particular qualities that are very dense and rich and sometimes haunting. It's kind of, it's almost incantatory, those images, really.
Yeah. It's not an ironic film. It's quite a sincere film.
Yes.
And I like that about it. Yes. I like that it feels like what it really feels like is because the director, I think, was born in 1962, so he would have been 6 years old or so at the time all this was happening. So he might have had very, very nascent memories of it, but he wasn't involved. He was a 6-year-old child. So it's kind of it's a sort of a nostalgia for somewhere he wasn't quite there.
Yes.
But what it is, it's really it's a sort of wonder of like what this time was, and the film kind of tries to build a kind of tapestry of what this intense now was like, which I think is very effective at doing, and the fact that it's not someone going, I was there and it was great. The fact that it's someone going like, I wonder what it was like. I wish I could sort of figure it out. Like that I suppose that kind of maybe made it easier to watch for me. Felt less sort of didactic perhaps. I really like that feeling of it. That sort of it's trying to capture something that or trying to understand something that you only have the briefest sort of experience of.
I loved so the film ends with a song sung in Portuguese, saying, "I'm too young to die, but I already have red roses on my tomb." And then the very last image is from Méliès, the workers coming out of the factory gate.
Yes.
Yeah. Which I thought kind of, was interesting, and poetic in a way, so kind of some of the first images of cinema, and again with all that they evoke, and all that they evoke about work and power and social relations and who's coming out of the factory gates and which direction they're going, and all of that with, something that was once intense but is now just kind of a ghostly flicker, something that once was.
I just wanted to the workers coming out of the factory was Lumiere.
Sorry, Lumiere.
That was on my mind because I thought it wasn't Méliès, was it? There's no special effects.
Of course, sorry. That's
no, but you're absolutely right. And yeah, it's sort of it marries the two sort of central themes, that of what we film and why and how, and the kind of documentary aspect, and then of course the actual sort of substance of being about workers and people's rights and all that stuff.
Okay, so let's end it here now. So after having grown through,
I didn't groan. I was only groaning when I felt it was outstaying its welcome, which I did think it does, and I don't think it's a perfect movie. I think it does get to a point where it feels quite self-indulgent to me. It gets to a point where it starts going on. I mean, even though it's not like I would just chop off the last half hour, because the last half hour also contained those scenes of the funerals that we spoke about, which I think are really interesting. Actually, there was one we didn't talk about, which was the police officer who died.
Yes.
In May, and the point is made that nothing was made of this at the time. It was the footage that is shown of it is from like a provincial newsreel,
yes.
And in writings about May '68, he's mentioned very fleetingly. I don't remember.
Not mentioned at all, is what the film is saying.
Basically, yeah. I don't remember the man's name, but he was a police officer who died, and it's sort of so there is a kind of I suppose the message there, or the feeling there.
René Lacroix.
Sorry?
I think René Lacroix is the name of the police officer.
Yeah, that's it, Lacroix. So the idea there is, it's kind of interesting that like the establishment in that sense sort of kind of didn't win. Like the police officer who died doing his job, I guess, is forgotten completely. In fact, he was murdered by as I recall, it was a van was driven at him without a driver. There's like bricks were put on the accelerator just to so a driverless van was
murder, basically.
Driven at him. Yeah, it was murdered, and in a vicious way. And he's kind of completely forgotten and not kind of venerated or anything like that, as the students protesters who died were, which is a sort of, I don't know what to make of it. Like on the one hand, I guess you sort of think the establishment sort of always wins, is what I've been saying about the message of the film. Like the establishment wins all the time, but in this case, it kind of doesn't. Like
it doesn't win the symbolic war, though.
Right.
So
yeah, that's
I think that's why the film is so interesting. Because it's dialectical in that way. It's kind of holding kind of different positions at the same time.
That's exactly right. Because what you're saying about we think of May '68 these days, it still remains in our consciousness about kind of what they achieved. But like, what did they achieve? Actually, what do people actually know of May '68 these days? People know the term May '68.
What they value is the protest. What they value is young people taking to the streets and having the courage to fight for change.
But if they knew the lack of results,
well, I'm not sure about the lack of results. I actually do think so. For example, in that factory that we're showing at the Wander, kind of gains were made, right? Yeah, so, they talk about the conditions of working there before, right? And kind of, you get a very clear sense that new proposals were put and people voted to go back to work. Because, there's the union representative saying, we have made real gains.
Do you then disagree with because the interpretation that the film puts on that, the director's narration puts on that, is that the conversation that they're having outside the factory is one of wages and workers' rights and working conditions. The worker, that was a young female worker, is complaining that she has an awful place to go and have a shit and that sort of thing. Like things haven't improved enough. But what the narrator is then saying is the now that the protests have kind of died down, the people who the establishment is reframing the protest as this was only ever about wages and working conditions, which was not the case. It was about higher ideals.
I agree with that, but you were asking what gains were made. So I'm saying, well, those were gains that were made.
Sure.
Right. So those are two different things. I mean, the narrator is mourning or saying, these events were never just about like better working conditions or better wages. They were about new ways of being and new social relations, right? And actually, there's a line at the beginning of the film where it says something like, this was a period where even homosexuals were unafraid or unhidden.
Yes.
Right? Like that you could be and you could live in the intense now as yourself. And actually, you might have had better working conditions at the end of it, but this sense of limitless possibilities of something that was new, right, were gone, right? So, yeah.
I think the way the film frames it over time is that it didn't seem to me that the film really spoke of the ideas of kind of practical changes of working conditions and wages until you got to that scene when they're talking outside the factory. Until then, and while the film was showing the midst of the revolution kind of in progress, it was talking about big ideas and and the way people wanted to change their work. So actually,
so better working conditions are a defeat.
Sort of. The way the film frames it, I think the film is framing it as a revolution of ideas, and I think that when we think back on May '68, that's the kind of way we think about it.
Of course. I was just responding to your.
No, I understand. Yeah.
And I don't want to belabor that point because that's right, and it is dramatized in that factory gate between what the young girl is saying, what the union rep is saying, and what the student is saying. There's all these social dynamics kind of being put forth in relation, to what May '68 represents.
Yeah.
Right. So first, the center, the focus, and then marginalization of students. This young girl who is hoping for a new way of life and not just a clean place to shit on, right? And the union rep who says, "Look, we made these gains."
Mm. The one other brief thing which I just vaguely mentioned earlier that it made me think of in relation to the modern day was related to the Parkland massacre and how the kids in America have now started to really speak up, I suppose, make their voices heard and actually and protest. And what it specifically made me think about was, and it was because of Cohn-Bendit. How he when he was introduced in the film, he's this kind of 20 or 22-year-old young guy who, as I said, is very eloquent and very impressive and really speaks well and holds his own against the adults and the establishment that he's speaking against. And I can't remember the guy's name, but one of the students at Parkland has kind of a similar role now. I wish I could remember his name. Unfortunately, I can't. But he's a kid who. Again, speaks very, very well, and is speaking, eloquently and intelligently about the problems with gun control or the lack of gun control, and the fact that he lost friends at school and the kind of mourning process and so on, and is becoming a kind of lightning rod for the gun control movement amongst kids and keeping guns out of schools at least. And it struck me that what people talk about now, the world has become sort of seemingly so polarized that to people on the left, he's a real hero, and to people on the right, he's a crisis actor. Literally the phrase they use, literally he's been brought in to pretend he's a kid, but he's actually been trained to say the right things. And it struck me that they struck me as similar because they're these basically young people who are able to scare the establishment by being, sort of more eloquent and more powerful than they expected.
Except the difference is that because so much of the people involved in May '68 were people who had access to means of representation of various kinds, right? Visual, sloganeering, written, and so on. They've been able to mythologize themselves in a way that I don't see happening in America. Even the students talking about the shootings and so on. I mean, it might change, but the thing about May '68 is that it's a myth, and it's a kind of a very potent myth. And actually, as you were pointing out in the Black Lives Matter, in the Me Too movement, this might change. Obviously, they're very recent events. Certainly, the image of that black girl with all of the police guns, machine guns in front of her, and so on, is very powerful. But whether it will be mythologized to the extent that this film demonstrates May '68 and the Prague Spring and so on, but particularly May '68 was, I would be very doubtful of, because actually, that young girl in front of all of these weapons doesn't have the same access to means of representation that these young bourgeois students, or largely bourgeois students, had in May '68.
I think that's an interesting point. Although one thing I would say actually with regards to the kids at Parkland is that it's something that Trevor Noah was saying, which I thought was quite an interesting observation, which was that the reason that these guys are sort of speaking up in a way that no one has before is that Parkland's a kind of a nice school in a nice area. And these are middle class kids.
Yes.
And so instead of their kind of something bad happening to them and they expect the worst to happen all the time, so they just live with it, they're kind of going, no, this isn't how things are supposed to be. I want to speak to the manager.
Yes.
Is kind of the attitude.
Yes.
Like things are going wrong. I want to speak to the guy in charge and get this put right. Which is so actually the thought.
The impetus is similar.
The thought of them being sort of middle class and bourgeois actually, if you accept that interpretation, is a kind of actually the reason that they are speaking up in a way that no one has before. But I think you're right, and the idea of it being how will it be remembered years down the line is a really interesting one, because for one thing, there are two kind of vastly different interpretations of what's going on at the moment. As I say, like depending on which side you sort of lean more towards, they're heroes or they're liars and actors in the deep state or whatever it is. So, like the idea that there can be any sort of single interpretation of what happens at any point is seems impossible to me. God knows how it'll be remembered down the line, and maybe the idea that that sort of. We have such an abundance of media now. That everything is recorded, and everything's able to be kept. And it's an overabundance. We've got way too much, as opposed to when you look at May '68, and it's not that you have a scarcity, but there's a lot less kind of footage and record to look at and make sense of. So maybe that has something to do with it. But like you can build any narrative you want out of what's happening right now by picking and choosing from so much. And then just frankly lying if you want as well. Like maybe that's, I think, because the idea of May '68 seems kind of monolithic. Like there is just one sort of cultural memory of it.
I'm not sure that that's true. And actually, what's interesting about this film is that really it's a Brazilian talking about May '68.
Yes.
Right. Whose only connection with it really is that his parents were living in France while it happened. Right, so I think kind of, May '68 had enormous impact on Britain and on the rest of Europe and on youth movements and on cultural movements. This possibility of revolt is a very powerful thing, and that's what May '68 stands for, I think. Anyway, let's wrap up.
Okay.
Were you glad you saw it?
Yes, I was.
And do you recommend it?
As long as you just have a coffee before it gets to the last half hour, because it goes on a bit. I think it's a really interesting film, and it talks about an awful lot. And what it does best of all is it evokes a feeling, which I think is what you want from a film. That's what film is good at. That's what film can do that nothing else can, and that's what films need to do.
Yeah, and so I just want to end by praising kind of MUBI again, because. It's really wonderful to be able to see this film. I think it's even better when it's programmed right next to Goupil's Half-Life, Mourir à 30 ans. So the possibility of watching the two together is like more than the sum of each of them, really. Well done, MUBI.
Have you seen Half-Life?
Yes.
And go on, just give us a quick. I've not seen that.
Oh, I agree with Salles that it's the most beautiful film of May '68 that I've seen. And there's something so beautiful about these young men, because it's one of those films in which young men are in love with cinema and they're in love with rebellion, and actually they love each other. It's about a gang of young boys, right? You know, who get involved, or they're high school students, and they get involved in the Communist Party, and you know, they begin doing student protests and so on, but they're also in love with cinema. So actually there are all these home movies of them that are beautifully shot, of them goofing around and making movies and being dressed up as nuns, right? And kind of, you know, making movies in their summer vacation and so on. And then actually these home movies of these adolescent kids, you know, having fun and experimenting and, you know, fighting and so on, then become, you know, the May 68, because they're all involved in it and they're all filming it, right? And they're all participants in it. So, you know, this thing about May 68 also being home movies, being about these people, but also framed by this idea that these people lived so intensely that once the event happened, it was almost like they had no life. That they all committed suicide, one after the other, after the other, after the other. Right, that's how the film begins. And actually that's the moment that In the Intense Now cites from Half-Life. That it's almost like they lived so intensely that they only had half a life, but you know that they lived a full life within that half-life.
They really do share that idea, and it's the Roy Batty thing from Blade Runner, isn't it? Of the candle that burns twice as bright, lives half as long, lasts half as long.
Yes,
exactly that.
And that's a beautiful way to end. Well,
with Blade Runner as all things.
So thank you very much for listening. We're on iTunes, we're eavesdropping at the movies on Facebook, we're on Twitter, and we're on SoundCloud.
Yes, and that's it.
Yeah. Bye.
We've got a website as well, haven't we? eavesdroppingatthemovies.com. But I mean, we've got to watch more movie stuff because it's movie stuff. That is because it's clearly a brilliant resource, and we haven't watched enough of it, and we watched too much Avengers.
Yes.
Although, you know, like we were both saying earlier, should we go and see Solo? Should we go and see Deadpool?
And the answer is yes, we must.
And the answer is yes, we must. Like you can't give up on big budget capitalist American pig dog stuff.
Yes, but you should expand your horizons a bit, because there is like this wonderful resource now that really is available to everyone. And actually it's very cheap. It's $5.99, which is like half the price of a film ticket at the cinema. And you get access to these real wonders of cinema, I think.
Yeah.
And the best of contemporary art house cinema.
Yeah, it's better than Netflix.
Yes.
Which has just got, you know...
Which is just shit.
Yeah.
All right. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.